Christopher Preston wrote an amazing book very recently, Tenacious Beasts, Wildlife Recoveries That Change How We Think About Animals. It's one of the best books I've read this decade, a compelling story that he's going to share with you about wildlife recoveries all around the world, in Europe and North America. And let me tell you a little about our distinguished author tonight. He is an award-winning writer based in Missoula, Montana. He's the author of 4 books. His work has appeared in The Atlantic, Discover Magazine, Smithsonian, EN, and the BBC. Actually, it'd be faster to say where his work hasn't appeared than the many places it has appeared. He is a native of England, but's lived the last 3 decades in the U.S., where he's energized by the wildlife and the large landscapes there. This is the interesting part. In addition to writing, he's a college professor, and he spent time, get this, as a commercial fisherman, a tool librarian, and a backcountry Park Service ranger. The diversity of interests is matched by the wonderful biodiversity in his book. Please give a very warm West Virginia welcome to Christopher Preston.
Well, thank you, Mark. Can everybody hear me okay? Thanks for the warm introduction. Thanks to the Friends group for bringing me out here. I'm super happy to be introduced by Mark because he is a fellow humanist. I should mention I'm a professor of philosophy. And ever since this book came out, I had this big fear. My big nightmare was that I was going to be presenting a book on wildlife written by a philosophy professor in front of a bunch of wildlife biologists. And then I find myself at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So the first thing I need to do tonight is to welcome you all to my nightmare. But I'm glad you're here. I wanted to start to set the tone for this book with a little anecdote about something that has nothing to do with wildlife. One of my other interests is clean energy and technology. And my town, Missoula, recently replaced their diesel city buses with electric buses. And on my bicycle commute to work, I remember the first day I was parked next to an electric bus. And so I'm sitting there on my bike, we're at a stoplight, and I look over and I'm like, oh, that's one of those electric buses. And then the light changes and the hydraulic brakes release, and then the bus just whooshes off into the distance, leaving behind a swirl of dry leaves. And I thought, this is what the future is. I can see it. I can feel it. I can hear it. No noisy diesel engine, no fumes. I can sense that this is a better world. And I want that better world. So that feeling is the basis for the ideas in this book. Standing on the dock in the dead of Arctic winter, Sven Anders closed his eyes to the northern lights above. All the professor wanted to do right now was listen. As the mountains and green aurora faded from his retina, the sound of a gently rippling ocean washed over his body. Seconds after his mind quieted, he heard a splash of a large object, followed by a fierce exhalation of air. Then he heard another, then another. A fishy scent wafted shoreward. Casting his head back to the sky, Sven Anders' mouth cracked open as he drank in the frigid nighttime air. He was perched on the doorstep of whales, dozens and dozens of whales, humpback and killer whales, drawn to Norway's Kald Fjord in the winter months to feast on herring. So I start with these whales because these whales are a quintessential tenacious beast. So what makes you a tenacious beast is you've had a kind of close brush with extinction. So humpback whales at the end of commercial whaling were down to about 5% of their original population. And now estimates are that they're pretty much back to where they were before commercial whaling. So that makes humpback whales a tenacious beast. I have a friend who lives up on the fjord there in Norway, and so these whales that I first encountered were in the Arctic, the bit of Norway that kind of bends over and starts going towards Russia. It's really a heck of a long way north. And that friend up there has a house on the edge of the fjord, and she told me she used to sleep every night with her windows open, every night of the year. And I thought, that's kind of some crazy Norwegian thing, you know, because that's up in the Arctic. And she said, when the whales are in, I can't have my windows open, because if I have my windows open, I don't get to sleep. What an honor to have your dreams disrupted by whales. And so whales are an unlikely tenacious beast, I think. This fjord, I mean, it became a thick soup of whales. Can you have too many whales? I mean, is too many whales a plague of whales? These are just big animals. They're not animals you would expect to see in that number. The blue whale, a relative, not doing as well as the humpback in recovery, but the blue whale is the largest animal in the history of life on Earth, and we get to share the planet with it. So humpback whales and fin whales and some other species of whales are recovering. That's what makes you a tenacious beast, and these are a great starting point for it. So some of you I know have read the book. I want to give you a little bit of a sense of what's in there for those who haven't. I found 12 or 15 tenacious beasts. It kind of depends how you count them as to what the total is. They're spread between the UK and North America, because those are the places that I mostly frequented. And so we've got, on farmland, we've got red deer and wolves, and these stories were mainly in Europe, and I talked about the wild boar as well. On prairie, we've got bison and we've got pronghorn antelope. I talked a little bit about swift fox there too, so that's closer to my home in Montana. On rivers, I talked about beavers, I talked about salmon. In forests, I talked about bears and I talked about owls. And then in oceans, I talked about these whales and sea otters. Now, those were the ones I chose, but actually you can sort of choose your tenacious beast how you see fit. And one thing I like to say to people is, after listening to me speak, just keep your ears tuned to the news, and you'll hear about a recovery. You'll hear about some good news, because there is quite a bit of good news out there, actually. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was an announcement about the European lynx, which is back from a low of 60 up to over 2,000 now. And they've moved from the IUCN list from being endangered to being threatened. So that's an improvement. So these stories are actually out there. Listen to them. But I am subject potentially to the critique that, oh yeah, okay, but there's still a biodiversity crisis, isn't there? And there is. So I want to be clear about this. I'm going to tell you good news stories. Hopefully I'm going to lift your spirits. But we are in a biodiversity crisis. And so why would I focus on these good stories? I've got 3 good reasons to focus on the good stories. This one, the one I've already mentioned. The feeling that I had when I saw those electric buses go by, just to kind of inject this idea that this is a world that we could live in if things go right. I also learned in the course of writing the book that following these good news stories gives you a good reminder of how biology works. Animals want to live. I sort of realized that when I studied some of these species that had come back. They want to live. If you give them the right conditions, if you make reproduction for them possible, if they have enough food, they want to live. They want to fill that niche and do their thing. And I think a good illustration of this is during COVID. We all stepped back and retreated into our homes. And as we did that, the animals stepped forward into those spaces. And it just lasted a short time. But I think that was an indication that they're out there and they want to do better if they can. And then the final reason, I mentioned I'm a philosopher and a humanist. I think it's important to look at recovering species because of how they give us new ways to think about them. So imagine a species that hasn't been around for a century. So from my part of the world, wolves, buffalo, you name it, a species that has been depleted for a century that you haven't had to encounter that much. The stories about that animal would have been the stories that were in place when those animals were reduced in number. And those stories linger. They stay in the cultural imagination. When an animal comes back a century later, we have different science, we have different techniques for dealing with them, we have a different public around them. And so the situation is different, and we can learn how to understand those animals differently. And so that's, I think, a third good reason to study the good news, is you can kind of dig in and you can learn about them afresh. So, one thing you think you would learn when you study recovering a species is some general rules for what does it take to recover a species. And I came up with one or two general rules. I'll give you one right off, and this one I can refer to the whales here, but I can also refer to the bison, the beaver, and the wolf. I spoke to a lot of conservation biologists. I did a number of site visits. I kind of learned what happened to make these animals come back. And the one golden rule, which I'm utterly convinced of, and this rule may surprise you, so get ready for it. The one golden rule, if you want them to come back, is stop killing them. Sounds kind of trivial, but it's actually kind of profound. If you stop killing them, they come back, at least in some cases for some animals. And all we had to do with the humpback whales was to put a moratorium on commercial whaling. Bison can reproduce at 17% a year in the right habitat. Stop killing them, and they come back. And so I think this is something we should remember when we're thinking about species that are still in trouble. And two examples that come to mind for me are wolverines. Wolverines that are still getting caught in traps in parts of the Rocky Mountain West, and North Atlantic right whales still getting hit by ships and tangled in fishing gear off the coast here. Stopping killing them is a good start to species recovering. So with that one lesson kind of in the bag, what other lessons are there? Well, the other lessons are a little more complicated. They're a little harder to learn about. So here we are in Italy, and these folks are pruning apple trees. And they're pruning apple trees for bears. And this is an odd thing for someone from my part of the world, because we actually do what we can to get apples away from bears. We don't want bears coming into town, eating the fruit off people's apple trees. But in Italy, they're pruning apple trees for bears. And that's because the apple trees are usually out of town. And if you can keep the bears out of town, they're not coming in and raiding chicken coops, eating through beehives. They're not in amongst the traffic. They're out there relatively safe away from people. And the bear we're talking about here is the Mexican brown bear, which is the second rarest species of brown bear in the world. For about a century, there were only 50 of them. Can you imagine that, being only 50 of you for a century? And now, thanks to the work of an organization called Salviamo L'Orso, who are part of the Rewilding Apennines Network, they're creeping back. And Mario Cipollone, who's the man who I went there to look for these bears with, I said, Mario, how many can I say there are now and not feel like I'm pushing it? And he said, I think you can feel confident saying 70. I think there might be a little more than that. So, 70 of this subspecies brown bear is not very many, but it's a 40% increase over 50. And the things are heading in the right direction. So I didn't get to see a bear there. You never get to see a bear on demand, but I did see camera trap images. And so here's one of those bears climbing up one of those apple trees that have been pruned. I did get to see some bear poop. And I cannot tell you how exciting that was. It was, we were walking through this oak beech forest, and there it was, right in the middle of the trail. And Mario and the small group of us who were there stood around it, and Mario said, you can see in the poop there's the beech nuts and the acorns that this bear eats. This time of year it's got berries, but it doesn't have a very strong digestive tract, so you can mostly see the berries there. And then he did something which was at first a little bit alarming, and I want to show you what he did. He walked over to where the poop was, and he picked up 2 sticks, and he squatted down and picked the poop up like this and brought it up to his nose. And so there's 5 of us kind of nose level to this bear poop. And he closed his eyes and he took a deep breath, and he goes like this. He opens his eyes and he breathes out, and then he says, "He's like a fine wine." It was a wonderful moment, and I asked him about it later, and he said, for me, it is like a fine wine. It's part of this region. It's part of our identity. And he said, if we lose this bear, we lose part of ourselves. And one might hear that stuff out in my part of the world coming out of the mouth of an indigenous person. If we lose this animal, we lose part of ourselves. But I was hearing it from Mario Cipollone, who is a modern Italian man and a bear scientist. And that made me think a lot about how important it is to incorporate these animals into our souls. And so I just, as I keep talking in this presentation, I want you to be thinking about what is that fine wine species around here for you? Or that smooth bourbon, or I don't know what's the right equivalent drink here. But what is the species where if you lose that species, you lose part of yourself? Here's a bison. It's a European bison. Probably not easy to tell from that photo, but these are a little different in how they look to a plains bison in North America. So that's bison bonacis. And it's rather than being a grazer, it's a browser. And these bison bonacis have just been reintroduced close to where I grew up in southern England. And there's no Great Plains in southern England. There are some overgrown woodlands, and the overgrown woodlands are what suit these bison bonacis. And it was incredibly exciting for me to see this reintroduction and the beginning of it's the start of a recovery, I guess you could call it. Because when I grew up in that part of the world, the biggest animal I could see in the woods would be a bunny rabbit. Maybe a fox if I was lucky. I did see the occasional dead badger on the side of the road, but that was it. Since I have left, deer have moved back into the area. So my sister's children can see deer. I could never see that when I was growing up. And now my sister's children can see a 2,000-pound bison there, which I think does something to your mind and does a good thing to your mind when you can see that type of animal around. Now, when they knew they were going to bring these animals back, they put out a job ad for 2 bison rangers. And I should mention, the animal was last seen in the UK 30,000 years ago, living wild, right? So they put out a job ad saying 2 bison rangers, no experience necessary. And I thought, how are you going to have experience of bison 30,000 years ago? But here's the other interesting thing. The bison that was there 30,000 years ago was an ancestor of this bison. It was bison priscus, the steppe bison. And this is bison bonacis, the European bison. And the person leading the reintroduction said to me, we'd love to have bison priscus, but we can't. So we have this instead. It's the best, second best animal we had. And so then that sort of prompts questions, is that a genuine reintroduction, a genuine recovery? Or is it a fake recovery? It's is it a surrogate species? And so these questions of authenticity start coming up. Like, is that the right thing to do? Or is this now, after 30,000 years, a non-native or invasive species? So that was one puzzle that I had. Another puzzle was that in England, before they could reintroduce these bison, they had to build 2 fences. They had to build a meter-high electric fence, and that was all you needed to keep the bison in. And they had to build a 2-meter-high razor wire-topped fence for keeping the people out. And that's because bison in the UK are characterized as dangerous wild animals. The law under which they were reintroduced was the Dangerous Wild Animals Act. And the rangers were complaining, we got to change the law. I mean, this is a native, or at least a semi-native, formerly native species. But the law, the way the country sees these animals is not adequate to address what they are. And interestingly, in Montana, we have that same issue with plains bison, who legally in Montana are categorized as livestock and not wildlife. So your laws reflect your philosophies, and you have to have laws that have accurate philosophies. So I said, all right, you take down the fences. What are you going to do then? They said, well, we've heard about this idea of satellite-guided shock collars. So if they can change the law, they think they can take the fences down. and then maybe they can keep the bison contained with satellite-guided shock collars into a perimeter. And you would actually need to do that because only 4 miles away, as the crow flies, is Canterbury Cathedral. And so there isn't a huge amount of space. But then that raises an interesting question about, okay, it's a restored species of wildlife, but how wild can it be if it's got to be stopped from moving into the outskirts of Canterbury just down the road? But in the case of the bison and in I've totally spaced on where I was going to go with the other. In the case of the bison and in this next case, the bears. In the case of the bison and in the case of the bears, it's not enough just to stop killing them. You have to put in place these very intricate kind of mechanisms to make things work out for these animals. And the third example where you have to put in an intricate mechanism, I think this story, since I wrote the book, has really kind of blown up in big ways, is if you want the northern spotted owl to recover. And so in the book I went out on the landscape with someone named Melissa Hunt, which was a very suitable name because she was taking part in the experiment to see if the northern spotted owl, which is in trouble, would be helped by killing the barred owl. And so they ran this experiment for 5 years, and the experiment involved shooting barred owls and just watching if the northern spotted owl responded positively to it. And they do. Their declines stop immediately, and the population starts to come back. And as a result of that, since the results of that experiment were published and made it through the sort of food chain, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has now declared a plan to kill up to 450,000 barred owls over the next 3 decades in order to save the spotted owl. And of course, this has generated a lot of controversy. It's interesting for me as an ethicist because obviously the ethical dilemmas here are huge. Should you kill one species of owls to save another? When I was interviewing Melissa Hunt about her work and the experiment, I said, how do you feel about it? And she said, well, I know it's controversial. Some of my friends jokingly asked me if I'm a member of Al Qaeda. But I said, well, how many owls have you killed? And I said, by the way, I'm writing a book, so this is going to go in the book if you tell me. She said, no, I'm okay telling you because I think it's something we have to do. I've killed over 350 owls. And so this is another case, these 3 cases, the bear, the bison, and these owls. These are cases where stopping killing the endangered animal is not enough. You've got to be heavily involved. You've got to really try and be on the ground, and maybe for a long time, and maybe doing dramatic things. So in terms of the lessons learned, the lesson on the right there is kind of like the simple one that works occasionally. The lessons, well, I guess your left, the lessons your right, on your right, are the ones where you have to be really kind of innovative. Your management has to be intensive. I've got blow things up over there because one of the stories is about dams. And sometimes you've got to do a bit of dam blowing up to help species. But those lessons on your right are really what's going to be typical of a lot of these recoveries. Somebody wrote about the book, what you learn is you just have to have an ongoing pragmatism to try and figure out what's going to work in each individual case. So, where I want to go now is I want to talk a little bit about the subtitle of the book. So, wildlife recoveries that change how we think about animals. Because obviously, helping wildlife recover is a scientific, a technical, and a practical matter a lot of the time, but it's also a social matter. Can we as a public learn to accommodate animals and the certain things they demand of us? Can we change our frames of mind so that we can welcome these animals back? And so I want to move to 3 species where I think the animal has shown us how we change our mind. And the first of the species that I want to mention is the beaver. And whether you're talking about Europe or whether you're talking about North America, we are talking about spectacular recoveries. So in Europe, the beavers have gone from about 1,000 animals to over 1 million. in North America from about 100,000 to about 15 million. And of course, what brought them down in number was an attitude towards beavers that treated them as, and the phrase that was used was hairy banknotes. Animals that were just good for skinning and making into a felt hat or something like that. And now when we look at beavers, we look at them in terms of all the ecological services they offer, all the ecosystem services. So whether it's fish habitat, whether it's helping riparian vegetation to flourish, and that vegetation in turn helping insects, whether it's water filtration in the creek, whether it is groundwater recharge just by having that weight of water on the land, flood mitigation. A study on the River Otter, good name for a river that you put beavers back onto. The River Otter in Devon found that 13 dams in this one area reduced peak flow of water during a flood by 30%. So you get fantastic flood mitigation benefits. And then out west where I am, you get this benefit, which is the possibility of a refugium or a sanctuary on the landscape when a fire comes through. And sometimes they can even work as a fire break. You can see here there's fire on both sides of the beaver pond, but certainly that wet spot will be a refugium for recolonization of that area in certain ways. So here is this transformation from hairy banknotes to really valuable set of ecosystem services. And Ben Goldfarb's book, and I think Ben Goldfarb's going to be out this way in not too long talking about his next book, but his earlier book about beavers created a whole new generation of what he called beaver believers. And one of the mantras in that book is, let the beaver do the work. Let the beaver do the filtration and the flood mitigation and the habitat restoration for you. Beavers are so good at this that we study them. We try and figure out how exactly is this happening? How is it working? And we do that in places where there aren't beavers, by building fake beaver dams, beaver dam analogs. How many of you are familiar with that term, beaver dam analog or BDA? You did? I built a ton of them. All right, because you're convinced of the good work that beavers do, right? These can help beavers recolonize an area. So an area that's not yet wet enough for beavers, you put some beaver dam analogs up there, and those beavers can kind of make their way back in. So here is a PhD student writing his PhD dissertation on exactly what that beaver dam analog is doing for water flow. So they're measuring things like upstream depth, downstream depth, flow rates. Here they've got PVC pipes in the ground, and the person on your right there is dropping a sounder down the pipe that is telling them where the water level is. So they want to know what the groundwater is doing underneath that meadow where those beaver dam analogs are. And so convincing is the evidence that what they're doing is good. Some of the questions actually are still a little, there's some things not yet answered, and I'll give you an illustration of one of those. A beaver dam analog helps with carbon sequestration because it helps creating a diversity of vegetation, but it might also increase methane release because of more wet and rotting vegetation. So, there's some science still to be done there, but all this science is happening because the evidence that the net story here is a net positive story is encouraging the building of beaver dam analogs pretty much anywhere people will have them. So with beavers, we go from hairy banknotes to this idea, I think, of beavers as experts and teachers. We are learning from the animals. And you can imagine that attitude coming out from an indigenous people saying, we're going to watch this animal, we're going to learn from it. But I think it's a less usual attitude coming from someone with the kind of training I have, for example. But I think this is a useful sort of attitude to employ. So I want to add an addendum to my beaver story, and this is not something that I was able to write about in the book because I didn't know about it yet, and this connects bison to beavers. So last summer I was out at American Prairie, which is in eastern Montana, where a private organization is, when a rancher wants to sell their grazing lease, this private organization is buying the ranch or buying the grazing lease, and moving cattle off the ranch and changing the permit to, where possible, and it's not an easy thing to do, change the permit to year-round grazing for bison. And so here we see a creek in eastern Montana, not in very good condition because it's had cattle on it for perhaps a century. It's also the middle of the summer. It was 102 degrees when I took that photograph. And you can see the creek in the bottom there. It's a little greener than the surrounding area, but it's not that much greener. When we walked down in there, there were dying cottonwood trees. It just wasn't very healthy down in that creek bottom. Then we traveled 25 miles away, and we saw this creek, which you can immediately see is in better condition. When we showed up there, 2 night herons, a great blue heron, and 8 American white pelicans flew off of this creek. So it was obvious right away that it was much more ecologically healthy. There's standing water on it. I just had a conversation actually last week by email with a scientist who I was out there, and I said, was that water flowing? And they're saying they're not sure. Usually the water stops flowing in that creek by August, but some of the old timers told them that that creek used to be year-round. Now this creek is in better condition because the cattle have been removed and bison are on the creek. And the advantage of having bison over cattle is the bison do not need the water so much. They need to drink it, for sure. They probably drink as much water, but they go in, drink the water, and then they leave and they go back into the higher country where the native grasses and forbs are what they like to eat. The cattle, on the other hand, are less well adapted to the heat. The cattle go into the creek. They like having their ankles wet. They stay in the creek. They pull vegetation off the side of the creek. And they basically make that creek a hotter, drier place over time by removing the shade and removing the vegetation and the composting material there. So this creek is expanding. The green space is getting wider. They told me that in some places that swathe of green was a couple of 100 yards wide now, and they've watched it get wider when the cattle were replaced by the bison. Then we walked down into that creek, and we saw this. It's a beaver dam. It's not a single stick or log in that beaver dam. There's just mud, and there's sedges, and there's rushes. As that place continues to get wet, the seeds in the seed bank there will start to sprout willows and cottonwoods. And then eventually those beavers will be able to build dams out of what they would like to build dams out of. And so what was interesting about this is we talk a lot about the beaver as an ecosystem engineer. But here the beaver needs the bison to engineer the ecosystem. So the bison engineers the ecosystem over a few years, and then the beaver shows up and starts engineering the ecosystem on top of what the bison is doing. This creek is called Beaver Creek, and the welcoming back of beavers on this landscape is something that American Prairie is super, super happy about. So beavers as teachers, showing us how to create climate resilience, showing us how to repair ecosystems, sometimes with a little bit of help from bison. Let me give you another example of changing how we think about animals. So these whales, which were sort of a favorite of mine in the book, and the role that these whales play in carbon sequestration. And it's about moving nutrients. They play this role in carbon sequestration because whales move nutrients. From the bottom of the ocean, if they feed down low, to the top, where they breathe and poop and hang out. So they are countering, they are their own biological pump, countering the natural tendency of nutrients to slowly rain down to the bottom of the ocean. Whales are moving those nutrients back up, and by bringing those nutrients back up high and pooping, they create phytoplankton blooms, and those phytoplanktons take carbon out of the atmosphere. So whales do that from bottom to top, and they also do it from high latitudes, Arctic and Antarctic latitudes, moving nutrients to equatorial regions. So some of the whales I studied are summering in Alaska and wintering in Hawaii. And all of that weight that they put on in Alaska in the summer, they lose in Hawaii in the winter. And when they're losing weight, they're peeing, they're pooping, they're giving birth, they're lactating. and you end up with these nutrients in the ocean. It's a conveyor, a movement of nutrients from high to equatorial latitudes, and that plays a role in carbon sequestration. So this area of science is an area I didn't know about before. It's called zoogeochemistry. And I just love that word. I encourage you to use it every place you can. Say that you're really into zoogeochemistry. And people are starting to put numbers on exactly how that movement of nutrients affects things. And so there's one number. A lot of these numbers are actually a little bit, they're tentative, they're a little bit shaky, but there's one number which caught my eye. If blue whales in the Antarctic recover, then you would gain the carbon sequestration that is equivalent to adding 43,000 hectares of rainforest. So the amount of nutrient movement that blue whales would do would be like adding 43,000 hectares of rainforest. So suddenly we've got whales that are not only no longer just oil and baleen sources, and not only just charismatic, interesting tourist subjects. We've got whales also playing a role in what is going to be quite a big battle, which is figuring out how to sequester carbon. And in the same oceans, sea otters are helping with that too by encouraging kelp forest growth, by eating the invertebrates that would otherwise mow down the kelp forests. So suddenly we've got these animals playing this role in the carbon cycle. So maybe we could start thinking of animals as climate allies or climate partners or something like that. And you can look elsewhere from whales. You can look at the predation of tiger sharks or the grazing of wildebeest, or the eating of seeds of tapirs and then the depositing of those seeds on the forest floor. And people are calling this aspect of zoogeochemistry, they're calling it animating the carbon cycle. So you put the animals back into the carbon cycle and you look for what they can do in this carbon challenge. So there's my two examples, right? We've got these beavers as helpers and teachers. We've got these whales and these otters and other animals as partners. Let me give you one more example. And this one is quite a hard one to talk about, but I think it's an important one. So the wolf, the beast of waste and desolation, the symbol of the wild, the sort of epitome of what needs to be cleared off a landscape so that civilization can happen, right? At least that's what the story would be. Wolves, this time I'm going to give you the take-home lesson first. Wolves are boundary crossers. And I'm going to explain two types of boundary that I think wolves cross. And the first boundary I'm going to explain by having you watch a little video clip. And this is an audience participation moment, okay? So what I want you to do is watch these two wolves walk across the screen. They're going to walk once at regular speed, and then they're going to walk in slow motion. And I want you to ask yourselves, how are these two wolves different from each other? Okay, you ready? Watch closely because I'm going to test you on this. Okay, how are they different from each other?
They have a different gait.
They have a different gait? That's interesting. So I had a wolf person in the audience for, when somebody said, was one pregnant? And the wolf person said, no, I think they just ate a big meal of deer. But yeah, one of them does look like it's just kind of a little wider in the midsection. How else are they different? Color? Size, good. We got a very. I knew talking about this in front of biologists would really get some good answers. But.
Their tails.
Tails. What are you seeing in the tail?
Well, one in the foreground, his tail is more bent down, and the one further one away, his tail is straight out.
Okay.
The first one has ears more pointed back on its head, laying back.
Uh huh.
The other one are more
Oh yeah, that's true. I hadn't noticed that before. So, yeah, and what is also true, it's pretty hard to see from here, but the one in the front has a slightly narrower muzzle than the one in the back there. So do you know why they're different? Yep.
Are these possibly two different subspecies of wolf?
Yes. Do you want to hazard a guess at which different subspecies they are? I'll give you a clue. So the front one is Canis lupus italicus, and the back one is Canis lupus lupus, Eurasian wolf, which is in most of Europe, and the Italian wolf, which originates from Italy but is now spilling out to France and Switzerland to the west, and spilling out to Slovenia and Croatia to the east. And this is a mated pair. So these two subspecies are mating again after, well, it's been at least a century since the Italian wolf was named as a separate subspecies. And they're doing so well, they're doing so well in Italy and so well in the rest of Europe that this is happening. So that couple met in Slovenia. And if you look at what they're called, the back wolf is called Slav, and the front wolf is called Giulietta, which I think is kind of appropriate for a Eurasian wolf and an Italian wolf. But they're also starting to breed now in France, where those wolves that have gone out of the top left there to the west have gone into France, up France, and now into Belgium and the Netherlands, and they're starting to meet Eurasian wolves that have come through Poland and Germany into the Netherlands, and they're starting to mingle again. So wolves are boundary crossers in that they can cross geographical boundaries. And the wolf is now in every country in continental Europe. So it's not in the UK, because it would have to swim to get there, but it's in every country in continental Europe, and it has not been reintroduced to any of them. So that's something to contemplate. They've made their own way into those countries. One of the biologists who told me about wolves, someone called Diane Boyd, who lives in Montana, Diane Boyd said to me, wolves live by their feet. And so because they live by their feet, they can move across these geographical boundaries. Here's another wolf living by its feet, and this is a wolf in Germany. There's no Yellowstone in Germany. There's no massive areas of wilderness for wolves to live in. There's quite a lot of forest. It's a fairly densely forested country. About 30% of Germany is forest. But this wolf is obviously out of that forest and is by the side of the road in front of a farm. And so wolves are crossing boundaries, not just the geographical ones. They're crossing boundaries between the wild world and the world we live in. The wild and the civilized. The boundary between nature and culture. The boundary between the worlds in which animals make their living and the worlds in which humans make their living. So as a philosopher, I find that very interesting. They're not just crossing geographical boundaries. They are crossing boundaries in the mind, conceptual boundaries. And the wolf is perhaps an animal we might expect to do this, because the wolf crossed the boundary into the human world 15,000 years ago when they became dogs. So the wolf is a particularly eloquent example of how animals actually don't stay in the wilderness. They come into our worlds, and we share those worlds with them. And though I think the wolf is sort of at the frontier of this particular point, you can make this point with other animals too. So here is Ursus americanus, looking mighty relaxed, having just had a nap. And if you look closely, that black bear is in a maple tree. And out where I live, maples are not, at least that type of maple, the Norway maple, is not native, because this tree is in town. And a couple of minutes after that photo was taken, that bear got out of the tree and walked across that road onto campus. This was move-in day in August, late August of 2022, 2 years ago. The berry crop had failed. There was thought to be 150 bears in town that fall. Missoula, Montana, where I'm from, yeah. And what was interesting about there being 150 bears in town for a month is that there were no negative interactions with people at all. We were all a little more careful. I kept getting emails from the university saying, there's a bear on campus, avoid this part of the campus. or look before you walk around there. So there was a lot of caution and respect. I mean, it's always important to respect wildlife. But there were actually no bad interactions. That was 2022. This is 2023. And these are also just on the edge of campus. This year, 2024, we've had a very bad huckleberry crop, so I'm actually super interested what's going to happen over the next month and a half. Because if it's anything like 2022, we'll have bears in town like we did then. And so we've got wolves crossing the boundary, showing that they're not just creatures of the wilderness. We've got bears doing that. But I think this is a general point, isn't it, about animals? That animals don't necessarily just live in wild areas. They come share the landscapes we live in. And I think this is another lesson, a third lesson of recovering wildlife species. That when we are around them again, when we see them again, we learn that we don't really control where they go. And some of where they go is going to be perhaps closer to us than we thought. And sometimes that will be okay. And sometimes we will have to take precautions. And so certainly that year when all those bears were in Missoula, some of them were caught in those culvert traps and taken back out further away from town. But quite a few of them were just left alone, and people were more diligent with any food sources. And then when the weather cooled down, off they went to hibernate back outside of town. So that third lesson is one that I think it's an important one, because it's something we don't just get from wolves, we don't just get from bears. We really should get it from all animals. If we let animals recover, we're going to be figuring out how to be around them more, figuring out how to cohabit, how to share a landscape. And that was a message, I think, in really all the species recoveries I discussed in the book, is like figuring out how to share space and to do it well is a really important thing. So I'm getting to the end here. I've just got one more. This is my last slide, and I want to read you one more little passage. Towards the end of the book, I was sort of cogitating on how to wrap things up, how to bring the story together. And I was telling somebody earlier today that when I first came over from England, I was at college in Colorado, and I said, "What do people do in the summer around here?" And they said, "Oh, they go to Alaska and they work in the fishing industry." So I'm like, "Okay, I'll do that." So that first summer I went up to Alaska. I ended up in Prince William Sound. I worked on a fishing boat, and I worked on a fishing boat for 4 summers in Prince William Sound. And we interacted a lot with the fish hatcheries there. So I spent a little bit of time in the fish hatcheries. And I got very interested in salmon and just very sort of drawn in by salmon. This impossible journey that they make out into the ocean, where they spend several years, and then back into the creeks. They sniff out the creek where they were born, and they will swim up to that place they were born and drop eggs, and make these redds and drop eggs into those redds, and those redds will be fertilized literally in the same section of creek that they might have been born in. If it was a Chinook salmon or king salmon, it could be up to 7 years ago, but they'll go back to that same place. So I live in the Rockies, and I had heard you could still see salmon close to where I lived. And I thought, no, it's surely not. I mean, I know historically there was salmon coming up here. But I did a little bit of research, and you could see salmon close to where I lived. So this is actually just over the Montana-Idaho border. And I had to do some sleuthing until I learned where it was. But eventually I kind of got there. And just as this guy had told me, I saw some king salmon milling around in this river. It's actually that's the Locksaw River. It was a little upstream of that, where the Locksaw splits. And those salmon had swum for 600 miles, and they had climbed 3,500 feet. Since I was there, and I wrote about that in the book, I've seen where salmon in the Salmon River in Idaho have swum 900 miles and climbed 6,000 feet. And so if there is ever a tenacious beast, it's a salmon. And they're dealing with deteriorating ocean conditions, They're dealing with dams that are slowing them down and making them subject to predators. They're dealing with fishermen. They're dealing with a lot. But somehow, some of them are still making it back up to these creeks to spawn. And you know, in the book, those of you who will remember this, I was at the Elwha, because the Elwha dams had come out a few years before. Now the Klamath dams are almost out. So the Klamath dam removals have replaced the Elwha as the biggest dam removals in this nation's history. Now there's conversation about the 4 Snake River dams coming out. The federal government has at least put that out there as one of the possible ways to make good on treaty obligations to the tribes. So salmon and these possibilities of dam recoveries, I think, are a real beacon for what might happen if things go right, if we do well. And fish are such a good exemplar of tenacious beasts because they are so prolific in their reproduction. So a king salmon female can release 6,000 to 7,000 eggs at one time. So I want to leave with us thinking about the possibilities here presented by salmon and by other recoveries, and why we must work so hard to make this stuff happen. Because, and I'm now just going to read, the work we do now will be a bridge to a world we can only dream of. Trickles of possibility will become cascades of life as animals regain the room to flourish. Just as we did for thousands of years in the past, our species will start to remember an ancient wisdom born of entanglement with the lives of animals. We will find ourselves bending once again to the pull of biological forces that never fully went away. So thanks very much for listening.
I'm Megan Birdie, the librarian for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We're here at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I'm excited to be speaking with award-winning author and environmental philosopher, Christopher J. Preston. Thanks for joining us today, Christopher. I'm really excited to talk to you.
I'm very happy to be here.
So what made you decide to write about wildlife recovery?
So I'm a philosopher, not a wildlife biologist. And before this book, I wrote a book on the philosophy of technology. And I was looking at technologies like biotechnology, nanotechnology, and how they were making the wild world disappear, replacing nature, really. And whilst I was doing all the work on that book, I kept hearing these stories about wildlife coming back against the odds. And I thought, well, I'm telling a whole story here about replacing nature, but that's not the end of it. Wildlife are coming back. And so I thought my next book would have to be about these tenacious beasts, a little bit of optimism.
And fantastic. It's such a great book, all the stories within it. We really enjoyed reading it here in the service. I wanted to ask also, you know, in this book club, The Wild Read, a common theme that we see is that struggle for control over nature versus coexistence or letting things be as they are. And as an environmental philosopher, what do you think about this balance or struggle of coexistence versus control?
Well, we've been very good at control for a long time. I mean, we've shown that we can really do that. And so the ethical question arises when the time comes to maybe step back and let go of a bit of that control, to make the decision to draw a line and maybe stop there and watch nature return, see what happens. And we're at that point. I mean, in some ways, the conservation movement is about putting a limit on the amount of control that we exert. And so it's fun to see rewilding taking off in Europe, restoration of wildlife species in various places in the United States. And you know, we're not going to completely step back and kind of hide away and give up all sorts of control and management. And indeed, some species require management, intensive management, to come back. But I think we're getting a better balance now than we did before.
So in your research, what differences have you seen in the European model versus the approach to wildlife management, conservation, coexistence in the United States? What are the biggest differences that you've seen?
Well, one thing that's been super interesting for me, and this is since I've lived in the United States. So I left England about 30 years ago now. And I came to the United States because I didn't feel like I had experienced wilderness. I started off in Colorado. I immediately started going to Alaska. And I felt like to experience the wild, you had to be on this continent. But more recently, the rewilding movement has really taken off in Europe. And it's incredible for me, as somebody who left Europe to come to the United States, it's incredible for me to watch that happen. And I mean, the reasons, I guess, are kind of obvious. If you live in a highly managed, highly populated landscape, you crave a little bit of wildness. And so the idea of rewilding has taken off there in really exciting ways. And in the United States, where you have a long tradition of wilderness protection, though that tradition is getting scrutinized again now because of the greater appreciation for the presence of indigenous people on the landscapes. But with that larger tradition in conservation, the urge to rewild has not been as strong in the United States as it has been in Europe. And it's super interesting to watch this kind of back and forth going on here, which I think is going to keep evolving over the next couple of decades.
So in 2023, 21 species were removed from Endangered Species Act protection due to extinction. And your book includes a lot of really amazing, inspiring stories of wildlife recoveries. But how do we balance that when there are so many species that are not recovering? How do we balance that hope and, looking at these fantastic examples, but also facing the reality of the biodiversity crisis?
Yeah, my big fear is I didn't want to write a book and people read it and think, oh, there's no problem then. We're in good shape. All these tenacious beasts out there coming back onto these landscapes. No, that's not what I'm trying to do. These tenacious beasts are recovering in the context of a global biodiversity crisis. But it's important to tell the story of the ones that are doing well. And it's important to look at those ones that come off the endangered species list in order to get a feeling for what is possible, to imagine what that future might look like. And so these stories, even though they are a minority of the wildlife stories out there, they're definitely stories that are worth telling for the inspiration they provide.
So looking towards the future, what do you think the future of conservation holds for us?
Well, I would say in the United States, we've done a pretty good job with protecting wilderness areas, in terms of the percentage of land. And I think what we haven't done such a good job on is protecting those areas that are somewhere between the wilder areas and the more densely populated urban areas. So the landscapes where people are farming, the landscapes where people are living, those landscapes are super important as corridors. They're super important really as laboratories for people to come to understand how to live alongside wildlife. I mean, that's where people are and that's where wildlife are. Mm-hmm. In Montana at the moment, there's a lot of emphasis on connectivity for connecting, for example, grizzly bear populations. And so this requires a real close attention to how do you share a landscape. You don't have to turn it back into wilderness or something like that, but you have to figure out how to share a landscape and how to live on it long term with animals. And there's a lot of room here to learn from indigenous people who've obviously done that for the longest time.
Absolutely. And I love what you're mentioning kind of about the collaboration, it sounds like, between private landowners, public lands, those spaces in betweens. And I think books like yours kind of tell the stories that can show private landowners what is possible. There were many instances in this book, but I wanted to ask you, if you could revisit any place that you had to visit for your research, where would you go?
Wow. I love Alaska. Alaska really kind of seeped into my bones. When I first came over from England, going to Alaska was just, I mean, I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The elemental character of it and just the plenitude of wildlife. I was just astonished that such a place existed. And I know that the rest of the United States every state's different. Nobody quite has the landscape of Alaska, but every state has its little pockets of wild areas. And for me, Alaska is a place that really got me motivated on this journey. And so perhaps I go back there for a little bit of inspiration and try and bring that idea back to states that don't have the land area, but have a lot of people willing to do the work to help animals recover.
Fantastic. I think we all have those places that inspire us. Can you tell me a little bit more about your writing process?
Yeah, well, I had the disadvantage of getting trained in academic journal writing. And academic journal writing, I've come to see, is not the best way to communicate with people. And so what I do these days, I do a lot of interviews with people, hope as many visits as I can manage to do. And at the time, I record my conversations, I take detailed notes, and when I get home, my first step is just to kind of blurt it all out on the page. Some people struggle to write the first word. I've never struggled with that. I get the words down pretty quick. They're terrible when they're first on the page. But then it's the rewriting and the polishing and the sharing and the listening to advice. And I'm very lucky. My wife is a fantastic critic of mine, and I learn a lot from getting her feedback. And so the initial step is easy for me, putting the words on the page. The latter steps, the polishing, the trimming, the making the story cohere, that's the bit that really kind of chews up the brain cells, and I have to put a lot of energy into that.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for authors who might want to shift from that academic writing perspective to more, storytelling or engaging with more popular audiences?
Well, yeah, we could have a long conversation about this. So one of the things when you come from that academic stable, you're there because you are convinced that the research you're doing there is super important. It must be, right? Because you have a PhD and you're up there at the front of your field. It takes a little bit to learn that what you thought was super important within your field might not be what's super important when you're trying to communicate with a larger audience. And that's a giant step to take, is to listen to people who might say to you, that's not interesting, but this is. And to just shift gears a little bit and communicate in a way that responds to what's interesting to a non-academic audience. And I'm still on that path. I'm still learning that. And it's a journey, but it's fun. It's like, in midlife, you kind of engage a new challenge and learn a new skill. And so I've really been enjoying that.
Well, we enjoyed the product of that so much. It was really a pleasure to read Tenacious Beasts. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Megan.